Let's see, agenda. There we go. All right, so today's agenda. So my name is Jeff Rogers, and I'm the CEO of Big Green IT. We're a tier 1 managed partner for Microsoft. Today we're going to do an introduction to Azure, which everyone here should get something out of, whether you're just starting to figure out Azure or you're already got some going in POC or going into production. Azure changes all the time, changes daily, hourly, weekly, monthly. So there's a lot of good information that we'll go through today. To keep that kind of live feel that I just mentioned, we're going to do today's webinar as a panel discussion, which I will moderate and field questions from you for both of our subject matter experts that we have here today to answer. To ask a question, go ahead and type it into the box, I believe, to the right side of the screen. Hopefully it's over there on that for everyone. It may come up in other areas, but there's definitely a questions area. So feel free to type that in along the way. I have some prepared questions that we'll go through, and then we'll weave in the questions from the audience at the same time, or just kind of as we go. We'll answer some questions afterwards as well, so we'll stay along for as long as people want to stay online to get their questions go through. Some of the more advanced questions might need to take offline just for the sake of time, or if we need to go deeper on, but absolutely go ahead and ask away. We've got quite an excellent team of people that are going to be here to go through those. So some of the prepared questions we have, you can see on the screen. I'll start with just some basic stuff of what is Azure, what are some common Azure use cases, what about security with Azure, how is Azure priced? That one's always very common. And at the end, we'll do some additional Q&A and wrap up as well. So this slide is very quick. So who's Big Green IT? Just so you know who the presenters are, who we are. We're headquartered in Sacramento, California, near Sacramento in a town called Rockland. We have offices in San Diego and Los Angeles as well. We're a gold platform partner for Microsoft. We're also a direct tier 1 Azure Microsoft 365 managed partner. And what that means to anybody who's listening is that we have direct relationships with engineering resources, technical resources, and all kinds of folks at Microsoft that we can get a hold of to help people with all kinds of projects that we're working on. Some of the clients, I just put them at the bottom just to give you guys a magnitude. Everything from small companies that have 20, 25 users. We have some restaurants, kind of more mid-size banking customers, casino customers. And on the larger scale, we've got some hospitals we work with where we're working on, in fact, right now on a migration of 11,500 mailboxes. So we work all across different size organizations. So my first slide, and I was going to actually take some time here to tell a couple stories of Azure and its use in the field, but I think it'd probably be more effective use of our time. We're going to try to keep this to maybe 30, 35 minutes. It might go longer than that, depending on how the questions come along and the answers that go with those. So the only thing I'll say before we get going on the panel part of it is, for me and for many people that have been in IT for 20 plus years, we've gone through a couple of IT evolutions, or both, I guess, are the same. And for what I've seen from Azure is it very much parallels what we did with virtualization 10 to 15 years ago, depending on when you started. And during that time, people would go, yeah, no, I'm never going to virtualize my production servers. I'll do a test dev server on VMware. I'll do this one little thing that we need to pop up, and we'll do that. And within a year, then it was more, okay, we're going to do these production servers. And then within probably a 3-year period, 90% of the world was all virtualized. And it happened that quickly too. And we're seeing a lot of the same things with Azure in that you start with a same thing, test dev. I've got a little VM I want to throw up there because it's easy to procure and put into Azure, and I'm going to run this thing on it. Then we're starting to do some testing and POCs with more advanced applications, and now we're finding full businesses just completely converting from, maybe on site they have 60, 80, 100 VMs on physical servers and actually moving them lock, stock, and barrel into Azure. So it's very similar to that, and the journey is very much the same. So I think let's just go ahead and get started with our panel and some of the questions. So I'll introduce our two subject matter experts that are here to answer these. And I don't know, Wade and Mike, if you have your video on now, but if not, go ahead and turn that on so we can see you guys. First, we have Wade Walker. Wade, yep, raise your hand. There you go. So you know which screen you're in or which square. Wade Walker is our Director of Cloud Services. And then we also have Mike Procker, who is both our COO and our Vice President of Cloud Services. All right, you guys ready for the questions? All right, sounds good. Okay, so what we're gonna do here, I prepped this with, we're gonna start with a couple of prepared ones. The most basic question is, what is Azure? I know a lot of people have some ideas, some concepts, and we hope that some of the people that are on this line, I'm gonna prep this a little bit more because I want people to know that everyone should get something out of today's presentation, whether you've been working with Azure for a while and you got stuff in production, or you have no idea what it is and what all the terms are, and you're just trying to get started because you know you're gonna have to do something with it, you know, in the near future. So I thought we'd start with what is Azure, and I think Wade, I'll start that one with you.
Perfect, thank you, Jeff. And if you want to go to the next slide. So before we get into exactly all the things that Azure is, one thing to note is this slide shows the regional scope, the global scope of Azure. So Azure is the second largest network in the world outside of only the internet. Direct connections up to 100 gigabits per second across the globe, including cabling that goes underwater, you know, between America and Europe and all over the place. 60 different regions in 140 countries. Includes the first public cloud in Africa. There's some government clouds for customers that need government level security. And it's important to note that in all these regions and all these data centers, it's not just Microsoft stuff that's running in Azure. It's Linux stuff, it's containers, it's web apps, it's a whole bunch of things. It's apps you can have on your iPhone and Android. So it's important to know that it's not just Microsoft services that run in Azure, but it's a wide variety of services. 98% of Fortune 500 companies use Azure. Some of the big names that you're going to hear of that use Azure: NBC News, BMW, AccuWeather, the NFL, Boeing, and more. So it's a huge network that spans the globe. And if you want to go to the next slide, please, Jeff.
I think so. Right button here.
Across the globe to make that happen.
There we go.
Perfect. And it's not just the biggest and fastest network, it's also the most trusted public cloud. We've listed here some of the security and compliance certifications that Azure has, more than Google, more than Amazon, more than anybody else. And we've got a link here on the bottom of this page to take you to the sites for Microsoft that list all of these compliance requirements. And we deal with this a lot of times with our customers, making sure it's got HIPAA compliance or FedRAMP, DFARS, and the list goes on. So if you're living in a world where compliance is important, it's critical that Azure be something that you're using in your environment. And then next slide, please, Jeff.
Yeah, and I'll touch on a little thing on that too. I know this kind of is one of those things where people throw around name drop or things as such, but it is including not just trusted, but the Department of Defense decided to put their $10 billion JEDI contract into Azure, and it was competed with AWS and Azure and so forth. So, it's one of those things that we get questions a lot, whether one-on-one or, with a customer site about what, how can we trust that our data was being taken care of? And so everything you have up on this slide, Wade, or that Microsoft provides as compliance and security and so forth, there's also just the selection of just these major either corporations or these major departments that are actually choosing Azure because of the security. So
And this is by no means a complete list. So
No.
you know, and
Just give everybody an idea.
exactly. And then to put it a little more tangible to look at of what is Azure, you know, everybody kind of begins their journey typically, you know, one step at a time in going to a public cloud environment. So we've listed up here some of the most popular workloads services within Azure. And in our experience, most people are going to start in the upper left, dev test, move some of their development and test systems into Azure. And then in the middle or right bottom little there, which is backup, archive, disaster recovery, DR. That's another one where people start really tipping their toes into the Azure waters and looking at dev tests or backing up data into Azure. These are usually great spots to start your journey. And then after that, these lists just goes on and on. You can move all of your internal business applications there. You can move all of your data warehousing, ETL processes into Azure, your virtual machines, your storage, and the list goes on. So this is a good little representation of the key workloads that we see in Azure. And we've got customers that run the whole gamut of running these services and more in Azure. And then what we've included here is a little comment from Microsoft on what it is. It's this ever-expanding set of cloud services. So that the important thing of there is that this slide continues to grow. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, for all we know, a few more things were released earlier today that in the Azure world, since it's basically a DevOps environment, we see that Azure is continuing to grow with more services and better services. So I wanted to give you that last little slide here to give a good little representation of what is Azure from a workload standpoint.
Perfect. And the other things that we don't always think about that are running in Azure natively are if everyone's or people on here move to Office 365, if you've moved to Microsoft 365, if they're using all of that stuff is running in Azure, and it's all over. I think that I really like the slide, Wade, the first one that we had up there of all the data centers in the regions. And to think about this web of all of the resources available. It's not just, oh, we have one data center in Portland and we've got one in Chicago and we've got one. It's just this network, and and people sometimes don't even understand how it can be that extensive and complicated, but also simple to add things like DR with just a click of a button, where I could be in US West, but my DR is in US East for redundancy, and it's that simple. So. Thank you for addressing that. Mike, did you have anything you might want to add to just on that basis, or we'll go ahead and talk about the next question?
No, we can move on. Do we have a poll coming up too, I think?
Yeah, in fact, let's go ahead and do that. I meant to do that before the slide. Thank you for reminding me. I'll see if I can execute that effectively here. Let's see, poll question. Well, that is really good. There was a button here earlier for poll question.
I can launch it.
I got it. There it is. Okay, launch. All right. So, are you going to launch here? Open the full on everyone's screens. Can anyone? I can't tell if anyone can.
Push the launch button.
What's that?
Did you push the launch button?
Yeah, I'm pushing the launch button, but it's not actively launching it.
All right. It just launched.
Okay. Oh, poll in progress. Distributing poll. There you go. All right, so if everyone could just answer that real quick, give us a good idea of, who was already using Azure and who hasn't even touched them. We want to try to cover everything for the entire audience that's out there listening right now. And it looks like as these are coming in that it's kind of what I expected, actually, that it's 50-50, pretty close to it. Yeah, and the reason that's important to know is there could have been a lot of folks that are out there that just even put something on a credit card just to start Azure, just to try something, and then you would answer yes to this, but still may be in the infancy of what you're wanting to do with Azure. So the poll question is it's exactly about what I thought it'd be, which is about 50-50. Okay.
Yep.
And by the way, and I'm going to go ahead and close this if I push the right button. And I hit close. I think it's just close your currently. Okay. All right, I'm going to move that back out of the way. So the other thing I wanted to say before we continue on here is that for everyone listening, you're welcome to take all the notes that you want. In fact, please do. It might have stuff that's pertinent to your business or remind you of a question you want to ask. But All of these slides will be sent to you, and all the links in the slides will be available to you, and we'll get that out in an email sometime tomorrow. Okay, so let's go to the next. So our next question is, what are some common Azure use cases? And Mike, I'd like you to go ahead and start with that one. And I can bring up the one slide if you'd like.
Yeah, you bet.
There we go.
So when we talk to customers about why they're coming to Azure, usually it's in the form of a migration or a migration assessment, or we're talking to people about some particular reason. And so there's a set of triggers that we've put together on the screen here. And this is usually what gets customers to talk to us about going into Azure. One or more of these might be applicable to why you're here today, but I figured I'd run through all of them just because these are really common reasons that people look at moving their workloads to the cloud. Data center contract expiration. So if you're a customer that has maybe moved some of your infrastructure off of your own premises, maybe last year or 10 years ago, maybe you moved it into a raging wire or another data center location, and that was the way we were doing this before the public cloud was really as big or as trusted or as secure as it is today. This was a really common way for people to get their workloads out of their back closet in the dusty old server room into a more reliable and scalable environment, but the public cloud wasn't really a workable solution yet. Well, now that we're finding people that have had 3-year or 5-year agreements, those are expiring, and you go back and look, and what seemed like a great deal back those many years ago all of a sudden isn't anymore, especially with Azure and Amazon to a certain degree having disrupted the pricing model as much as they have. Pulling down a rack or half a rack at some data center 30 miles away just doesn't make cost sense anymore. It's also probably that equipment doesn't get upgraded on the same schedule. It's probably on the same machines and storage that it was back then. And you start looking at what you're paying for it, looking at the performance and reliability you're getting, and realize, well, this is a really good time to start looking at possibly moving things to Azure. One of the other things that comes up pretty often is integrating acquisitions. So we have one customer in particular that we had already been doing their Office 365 for some period of time, and they have a little data center, again, dusty backroom closet with 3 servers and a SAN running a bunch of workloads, and they bought a company in Southern California. And the company they bought down there, they had some people they wanted to keep and some resources and some knowledge and some expertise, but their systems weren't really anything. There was a lot of duplication of what they already had, but it was older equipment, and they didn't really want to keep it, but it represented enough additional capacity requirement that they would have had to actually do a pretty significant little build out in their backroom system. And rather than doing that, they weren't really ready to refresh their own environment and go through all that. But by taking that Southern California operation and putting the entire thing into Azure, it was kind of a perfect fit. We were able to get it up and running very quickly. We were able to build it exactly the size that they needed and not any bigger than necessary. They knew that a lot of those workloads were going to be temporary. Some of them might only be around for a year or so while they were phasing out an old application. So they didn't have to look at the big capital expenditure of buying a bunch of hardware they were going to be stuck with. And so we moved it into Azure for them. Ran it there for 6 or 7 months, and after kind of getting a taste of the flexibility and the performance and the scalability that was available in Azure, we wound up moving a bunch of when it was time to do their hardware refresh of their on-prem environment, we actually wound up moving a good portion of that stuff into Azure as well. So integrations, whether you're buying a company or moving your resources into someone that has bought you, either way, the moving things into Azure can be a really good way to facilitate that. Another thing that happens very often is urgent capacity needs. There's a large sales event that happens. Maybe this is the direct result of the acquisition we talked about a minute before. Maybe you're a seasonal business that only needs compute resources certain times of the year. Any of those. This is the thing about the cloud everybody knows. This is kind of the low-hanging fruit part. Yes, of course, you can scale up with the turn of a knob, and it's easy to do. Well, it is real though. It's important. You can't, if you upgrade your storage on-prem and upgrade your host VMs on-prem to handle a peak capacity, you're paying the same amount for those resources, whether they're running or whether they're not running. And in the cloud, that doesn't have to be the case. You can just pay for that stuff when you're actually using it. Software and hardware refreshes. 5-6 years ago, when we were doing more kind of legacy business, some servers and some storage at your site or at one of your location sites, and hardware gets a little old, it gets a little slow, your maintenance contracts are up for renewal. They'd give us a call, we'd come out, we'd have lunch, we'd take a look at everything that's in the back room, we would take inventory of stuff, and we would give a quote on new hardware and new software, and maybe some professional services to pull the old stuff out and put the new stuff in, and we just did that every certain number of years. Now what we're finding is when we do that, we're still doing that same exercise, because even though we're strong proponents of the cloud, and especially Azure, we do know that it's not always the right solution for everyone, and it's important to look at things pragmatically and not to sell cloud just because it's the newest, coolest thing to have. We use cloud when it makes sense, and we use it in the best ways that it can be used, but we don't just shove it on everybody. So when we have a client that it's time for them to look at a software hardware refresh, we go through the same exercise we always have, but now almost every time we go through a parallel exercise of showing them what it would cost to run that same infrastructure in Azure. And simply running that infrastructure in Azure isn't always the best use of it. We're not really taking advantage of a lot of the flexibility you can get when you use Azure properly and take advantage of cloud native applications and things like that. But it's a good way to get a quick goof check. If I figure I'm paying $5,000-$10,000 a month to run this stuff on-prem, maybe it's $6,000 in Azure, maybe it's $15,000, but if you don't know, you don't know. So as part of that process, we always try to recommend an Azure analysis as well at the same time. Another exact scenario we've run into in the past is a compromised system or some other security threat. We've had small customers come to us from out of nowhere because they had one of their servers that had been on-prem for a really long time managed to get CryptoLocker software or some other ransomware, something where that server's been compromised. A lot of times these smaller clients don't really know how the threat got in, where it came from, what really happened, and their way of fixing it is just to shut everything off and disconnect it from the internet, but they have to replace that functionality somewhere. So rather than trying to decide what to turn back on-prem or buying another server to replace a perfectly good piece of hardware just because you're afraid of the security risk, well, maybe we can light that other workload up in Azure, up in the cloud, in a controlled environment where it's not directly connected to your other systems, but maybe get that functionality back online without risking the rest of your environment. You can test things there, and if everything works the way you want, then you can go ahead and turn it back on-prem. Or if you like the way things are functioning, maybe that's the beginning of your Azure journey. You fire up one system to replace a compromised one, and we start migrating the rest of your resources from on-prem up into the cloud. Compliance. GDPR isn't nearly the big topic it was last year, the year before. The CCPA, half our customers don't even know what that is yet, but these are both sets of requirements that businesses have to comply with. Frequently, it's a lot easier to take the parts of your business that need to meet these requirements, remove them from your legacy systems where you may not meet all those compliance requirements, but put it up in Azure where you have a clean slate in a cloud environment where the environment itself meets all of those certifications already out of the box. And as long as your applications don't do anything to punch holes in that security or actually break it, then your applications can be compliant as well. So we've done that for a couple of customers also. This next one, innovation of applications, delivering apps faster, things like that. These are relevant to companies that do write their own applications or customize their own applications. If you have a lot of developers in your organization and you do perform this kind of work and you write your own apps, there are all kinds of things you can do with native cloud applications, with Azure Functions and running in containers and different things that are either very difficult to do on-prem or they require kind of a paradigm shift and a whole new way of doing things. And we found that when companies are faced with a whole new way of doing things, sometimes it's easier to do that in a fresh cloud environment than try to bring your old environment up to speed to do things like that. So that's another very popular one. And then finally, end of support and end of life for certain server software. Windows SQL 2008 is end of life now, or it is in January. I don't have my other slide up. Windows 7 has been end of life, but you can have that extended in Azure. So with Windows Server 2 and SQL Server 2008, and with Windows 7, the desktop operating system, Microsoft has actually discontinued support for those products. They're end of life, which means that if you're in industry that is audited or needs to be HIPAA compliant or need to meet other types of compliance requirements, you can't with an unsupported operating system. However, Microsoft will officially support those operating systems if you run them in Azure. So you can still run Windows 7 for an additional 3 years of support, and Server 2008 and SQL 2008. You can run those in Azure and they will be supported by Microsoft, as opposed if you leave them on-prem where they won't be. So it's kind of an obvious little tactic, obviously, for Microsoft to try and push you into Azure, but it's a real thing. 3 years of support isn't free, and there are still applications out there that were not written to run on the more modern operating systems, and this is a way that you can extend that stuff for a few more years just by moving it into Azure.
Perfect. I appreciate that, Mike. That's a pretty comprehensive slide with all the different areas that people can think about for Azure use cases. Many times we do either these presentations or others just to kind of get everybody's wheels turning. You know, there may be one thing in there that's important to you. It's like, ooh, that's something I want to think about, maybe moving a server over or an application, or maybe everything. But the idea is to get some stuff started and thinking about the use cases for Azure. So I've got a question, and I know Wade, you answered this one online, but I think that the question could be pertinent for everyone. So I'm going to real quick read this one, and if you could answer to that, it'd be great. Okay. Yeah, the person, his name is Matt, but does Azure support AD authentication for local and remote workforce? Also, does it support print services? And can remote workloads access AD file shares? So in any order, but maybe a quick answer to that would be helpful for everyone.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for asking that question. So Active Directory authentication is natively supported in Azure. And as I replied to Matt, a common way to synchronize an on-premise Active Directory environment to Azure is to run a free tool from Microsoft called Azure Active Directory Connect. And that then synchronizes your on-premise Active Directory environment with the Azure Active Directory world. In addition, you can run Active Directory domain controllers in Azure. And then Azure has its own Active Directory domain service that runs. So there's a few ways to leverage the Active Directory environment in Azure, but most definitely your Active Directory environment can be running in Azure, and the directory service that does the authentication for both Azure and Office 365 is technically called Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, and that's what gets synchronized to with Azure AD Connect for your on-prem AD environment. And then the next question Matt had about file and print services and the people accessing these file and print services. Azure you can run a virtual machine in Azure running a file service, print service, and people can access it through a wide variety of methods, VPNs, some other ways to get in there and connect. And then there are some native file services from Azure. One's called Azure Files. One's another one we partner with, Azure NetApp Files, and people can run file shares in there and access those files. And then a common file service from Microsoft is SharePoint Online, which is the file service structure for Office 365, and you access those files via SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive. So there's multiple ways that people can access files.
Yeah,
in Azure and Office 365.
Print services aren't there's not really very much built into Azure natively there. You can be looking at your own, standing up your own server. However, with file services, there are native, robust, high performance ways of handling your files with SMB, CIFS, and NFS connectivity with Azure Active Directory or regular Active Directory authentication built in, and also with global file locking capabilities. So if you have files that are on-prem running on file servers at different locations synchronized with Azure, and we can have it. So if you've got someone with a CAD file open in New York that's working on it, and then someone in San Francisco tries to work on the same file, they'll get a notice that it's locked, and all of that is stored in Azure centrally and then cached locally out at your end site. So there's very robust file services natively built into Azure, not so much for print services really. There's some third-party tools that do it.
Excellent. All right, thank you. We're going to go to one more prepared questions as well. So this is very common question. We get this every time at every event that we've done over the last year and a half or two regarding Azure, and that's what about security? And Wade, I'm gonna throw that one to you.
Okay, perfect. And it ties in with Matt's question. You see in the upper left there, security starts with our identity management. So it's all about Azure Active Directory. And as I mentioned, that's a native service in Azure, and I'd say 90% plus of our customers synchronize their on-premise Active Directory with Azure Active Directory using the Azure Active Directory Connect tool. And that way you have a synchronized single sign-on to both Office 365 and Azure, just by synchronizing your on-premise Active Directory environment. You know, security is key these days. I was reading a stat that since the pandemic hit, the percentage of attacks on Microsoft's infrastructure has increased more than 50%. People are, you know, some bad people out there trying to break in. And then we're seeing this with a number of our customers, a huge increase in email phishing attacks. So it's important when you do have an Active Directory service or any kind of identity management, turning on multi-factor authentication, which is like, you know, you type in your password and you get a 6-digit code to your phone, and that's that multi-factor, that's that second factor. So important to do that. And you've got all those capabilities within Azure and Office 365. The second line of services I've listed up here, Azure Security Center and Azure Advisor. These are really some powerful growing services within Microsoft. And they somewhat work together in addition with Azure Advisor. There's a newer product called Azure Cost Management Plus Billing. I put that in there in the blue. Those two work together and in essence, assess your environment and give you recommendations. So you can look at Security Center and Azure Advisor, and they just automatically are assessing your environment and saying, hey, you've got some open ports here, you've got some, you know, access we need to look at, and the list goes on. So it's nice that these things are built into Azure. There's a free version of or free tier of the Azure Security Center, and then a paid tier, which adds more security services. And these things are native into Azure. The next line of Azure Login Analytics and Azure Sentinel. These are some new and improved services for collecting, searching, and looking at all your logs, performing some analysis on them. And then Azure Sentinel is a new security information event management, kind of like a big syslog server where you can send all of your logs into one SIEM solution, the security identity event management solution, and run your analytics on it and threat management and see what's going on. With Key Vault, you can store passwords, encryption keys, and everything, and then reference them within Azure. And then one thing we don't always think about with security, with that bottom row of Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery, these are really critical to any organization. Really need to back up and protect your data. And Azure Backup can do that for both on-premise data and Azure data. And then Azure Site Recovery is a way to have like an orchestrated failover, disaster recovery as a service, and some other features. And it's a key tool for doing Azure migrations. So it's with these bottom ones, which obviously don't get a lot of press and they're not always sexy, but they're important. We need to be backing up our data, and then we can have a disaster recovery as a service through Azure Site Recovery, which is a very powerful way to have a failover site without having to, you know, stand up oodles of servers at some co-location facility on the other side of the United States. Now you can just have your disaster recovery environment running as a service within Azure. So that's the highlight we wanted to hit today with some of the key security and management features of Azure.
Well, to add on the security pieces, that's everything that's from the Microsoft side of the world. There are a ton of third-party security options as well. Things that you think about as far as getting into Azure and how your firewalls are going to work. Can I transfer my Palo Alto to an Azure? Can I do that with Barracuda? Can I do that with all of those things that are what we think traditionally of in a data center? That how am I going to protect the perimeter? How am I going to protect the internal parts of it? A lot of that is taken care of by Microsoft, but a lot of that's open to the third party for those added layers of security as well. So lots of stuff. I mean, 2 to 3 years ago, we saw firewalls as just, they were taking the code that was on an appliance in your data center, and they were just kind of taking that and putting it in a VM. It wasn't really written specifically for Azure, but the last 2 years plus of doing that has matured that third-party product lines that are starting to become native now to Azure, or running to be built to be run in Azure specifically. So lots of good stuff there. If you have any questions on security, I didn't see one come up, but by all means, type things in. I'm going to keep moving along for the sake of time, and we'll skip the participant question here, but if there's more that people have, we'll catch those at the end. So our next prepared question is the other one that we get the most questions about. How is Azure licensed? How's it priced? How do you get it? What are all the different methodologies there? And I usually have Mike answer that, so I believe we'll go that direction. And Mike, is there a slide here for you? I think so, right?
Couple, yeah.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. I'll let you run this how you want, and I'll flip through the slide part.
Sure, you bet. So I'm gonna assume, especially since half people here are already dabbling with Azure already, that everybody understands that when you buy your compute and resources, like if you're buying a virtual machine or something that's easy to relate to, how it compares down here in the regular on-premise world, it's essentially you're renting services from Microsoft. You're renting CPUs and memory, and you're even renting your software licenses, whether it be Windows or SQL or some other workload, and you're paying by the minute, by the second, I think, on some workload. No, it's by the minute, and you're essentially renting those services. So there's a lot of ways where that can make a lot of sense. If you have a service or services that only need to run during business hours, well, 40 hours a week times 4-point-something weeks, that's 100 and I would call it 200 maybe hours a month. Well, there's 730 hours in a month. So just that math on its own, if all else being equal, just by only running workloads when you need them running, can save a huge amount of money. That's kind of the obvious, hey, this is the cloud, we're renting stuff, as opposed to having to buy it. Plus, when you're done, you turn it off. If you need to scale up, you scale up. You scale down, you scale down. That's kind of the basic gist of how the public cloud works and how you pay for and consume resources. There's other things that you may pay for all the time that are not based on an hourly basis, but for the most part, that's kind of how it works. So rather than kind of overnoodle that very much, I'd like to talk a little bit about the ways that you can price Azure services and license certain Azure services where you can really make things start to make a lot more sense. Some of these are specific to Azure as well. So the first one is something called the Hybrid Use Benefit, or HUB for short. Lots of acronyms at Microsoft. And what that means is if you have Windows Server or Windows or SQL Server licenses that you already pay for in the perpetual licensing model, so the on-premise model, whether it be open value or enterprise agreement or an NPSA or whatever it was, if you're paying for those licenses now with software assurance, then you can migrate workloads to the Azure cloud without having to buy those licenses again. And so the way that works is, if you look at the price for a virtual machine in Azure, we'll pick some, D2 or D4, whatever size machine that happens to be, and let's say it's $130 a month for a Windows server. Well, if you take Windows off it might only be $100 a month. So if you're at $130, 30 of that might just be for the Windows licensing. So if you have 10 of those servers and you can just pay for the compute natively and without the Windows licensing, which you can do if you own the Windows licenses already with software assurance, you know, you can save, what's 10 times 30, $300 a month. It's significant. The price savings can be 20 to 30% in there just for that licensing portion alone. So that's one thing you can do in Azure that you cannot, that you can't do in Amazon, for example. So that's one way. Another thing you can do is something called the reserved instance, and this is common. Other cloud providers have this as well, but there are some things unique about the way that Azure does it, and it's a little complicated to get into the weeds of the details. But basically, if you commit to having Azure VMs or Azure storage even for a 1 year or a 3 year period, you don't have to pay for it all up front. You just have to commit to it up front. You can save on those resources another 40-45% depending on the size of the machines that you're talking about, and still pay monthly. So you can get the benefits of a 1 year or 3 year commitment without having to write a check 1 year or 3 years in advance. Now you combine that with the hybrid use benefit, and you can get some very, very significant savings. And this is a very common part of when we do an Azure migration. We have several phases we go through, and the second to the last phase is generally once the environment's locked down, we know that it's working the way you want it to work. Then we can say, let's commit to this size of an environment for a year or so and shave 40% off of your costs. And that's very, very popular. We do it all the time. Another really nice thing about the way Azure does it is if you change your mind or if your environment needs change, you can trade those reserved instances back in for other ones that fit your needs better, and there's no penalty. In fact, if you cancel entirely and break all of your commitments, the maximum penalty in a situation like that is something like 12%. So even if you make a year commitment, once you've kept it for 3 months, you're break even if you back out entirely. So they have these commitments, but I like to say they don't really have any teeth. There's not much that they do if you break them. It's not like buying a house or something where you have to really stress over the commitments you're making. So it's a win-win. We do it all the time for our customers. The last little piece of this slide is those extended security updates. That's part of the thing I mentioned earlier about when you move Server SQL 2008 or Windows 7 into the cloud, you get extended updates for an additional 3 years. So I think there might be another slide, Jeff. Is there?
Yep.
I pretty much dove into this. This is because you're getting the slide deck when we're done. This will give you some more details.
Right.
This is really just the backup to everything I've already alluded to. And there's another one. Another nice thing. I mean, I guess it's not that exciting that when you buy a service, they tell you how much it costs. That's good of them, right? But the Azure Cost Management Billing Portal, especially compared to what it looked like 4 years ago, has grown into a very sophisticated cost allocation and management tool. So it's not just a way for you to know how much your bill is going to be. This can also give you great insight into what your infrastructure is costing and what you're paying to run your IT infrastructure. This is probably knowledge you don't have in your on-premise environment. Or if you have this knowledge now in your on-premise environment, you have to pay extra for some third-party tool to get it. This is a snapshot of the cost management and billing portal that you get as a Big Green IT Azure customer. You just get this right out of the box. And some great functionality in here. There's all kinds of resource tagging by department we can do. There's a lot of different things we can do on the billing and cost allocation side to help you make sense of what things are costing. That's a more common question we get, especially the higher up into the C-suite we get with CIOs and CFOs and CTOs is not how is it priced so much as how do I control those costs? There's always, not always, there are frequently these war stories that come out of people that jumped into Amazon 11 years ago because they gave some developer a credit card to turn up a development server for some pet project. You look back and now they're spending $60,000 a month, all their infrastructure's there, and they want to, you know, they can't understand where it all went. We're very cognizant of that, and we're very careful when we help people design their environments and migrate their environments to go over, you know, these are safe, easy things to do that you're not going to get stuck with, versus certain things you want to be very careful before you jump in because you're making a huge commitment. So we have the expertise to go through all those scenarios with you.
Okay.
I think that might be my last one. Oh, yes, the old licensing slide. While we're talking about Microsoft licensing, there's a million different options. Both from a licensing perspective, most of the options and choices are on the Microsoft 365 side with, you know, email and SharePoint and Teams and that kind of end user office productivity stuff. But in Azure, you know, we talked about a few different ways to do that as well. And then you combine it all together, and you've still got some perpetual licensing, some on-premise stuff, some software assurance. Maybe you've got an enterprise agreement that you're not sure if it still makes sense. We can help you. We can answer that question. Does it still make sense? Maybe, maybe not. We could, one of the things that happens when you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft is you're paying into, as long as you keep that going, you don't have to rebuy that software. So people, they're afraid if they break their enterprise agreement, they might have to pay again to start over. And we have ways that we can do a migration and keep those software assurance benefits from one contract type to another. So moral story is basically we can handle all the Microsoft licensing stuff. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to go pay for some complex software audit, you know, of the entire environment to get answers to these things. We can answer it all for you. So just give us a call. And if you're currently paying for any Microsoft services directly on a credit card now, we can definitely do a much better job for you. Just let us know.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Okay, let's see. I think for the sake of time, because I want to make sure that we're already a little bit more than I thought we would go, but it's good because we're getting some questions. We're getting through a lot of the content here. We'll save if there's additional questions. There's some we've answered along the way in our responses through the chat type of thing, but most of them were answered by either Mike or Wade here as we've gone along. So I'm going to go, I think I can turn back on my video. Let's see if that works. So this one is just kind of a next step. We're getting towards the kind of conclusion here. You know, I don't want to be self-serving. That's not what our intent of all these webinars are. They're really trying to be informational, make you think about different things for your environment, questions you're going to have, show that we've got some knowledge and capability. But really that third one down is, you know, you've already said, because you've already made some decision already to evaluate Azure. So we have an assessment that we do. It's a lot like the Azure calculator, which anyone can do, but what we have found and what other potential clients have found is they try to work through it themselves and it just ends up all over the place. So we run it as a base thing, and then either Wade or Mike or one of our engineers goes through it and goes, okay, real world is we don't need that kind of a server for, you know, domain controllers. We don't need that size. And we get it all down to do an assessment to give you the results. It's free. We do these all the time. It's that first kind of comparison, if you will, of what this environment is running like today and what it might look like to be in Azure. So we will do those assessments for you at your request. I push the right buttons here. Okay, so this basically on the right-hand side of this are different resources, different things that we have going on right now, cloud consultations that we do for free, the Azure migration assessment that I just talked about. We actually have for the COVID-19 relief, we've been asked by a lot of customers about, or even potential ones about, for this one in particular is for Office 365. But if you either have it with another provider or Microsoft Direct on a credit card and you move it to us, we can actually provide you 1 month free as a cost relief. So we can keep that in mind. The only other bullet here that's really important, especially when it comes to, well, two of them when it comes to Azure, is the mention about the data center optimization program. We're part of that. There's a very select few that are part, and we get direct relationships with Microsoft at engineering level 3, 4, 5. That we can get questions answered or projects worked on, and even POCs. as well as the Premier support is something that's high. That's anybody that's dealt with Microsoft's either normal support or advanced support, not that great. We actually are part of the Premier support program, so we can get a lot of tickets taken care of at other direct with Microsoft or otherwise might not be able to. I think what we'll do here is I will look for some more questions, but I got one more slide here that I wanted you to see, and that is this is all of the links that you will have when you get this slide deck, that you'll be able to get to some of the sources besides the slides themselves, and everybody should be able to. So let me look real quick, and it is about 50 minutes in. The questions, like I said, we answered a lot of these along the way, so I think, no, Mike or Wade, I'll say, do you have, either of you have any closing comments about this topic? I mean, I know we answered and went through all of this together.
No, I mean,
okay.
see, it looks like we got everything that's in the question thread.
And the only thing I want to bring up lastly at the end is for those that haven't touched Azure, as we mentioned early on, most of our customers start touching Azure through integrating Active Directory into Azure or Azure Backup or testing like one virtual machine, or as Mike hinted on, some of those, like if you've got an end-of-life system, SQL Server 2008, Windows Server 2008, let's try to move that particular virtual machine in or set up a new virtual machine in Azure with a newer operating system. So for those that are looking to like kind of dip their toes in the water and test, those are usually where we see most of our customers do their initial foray into Azure.
And then we've done that for everything from that to full-blown e-commerce sites move all at one time. So there's quite an array of things that are happening right now. The only other thing, and unfortunately I don't have a slide, but when you registered for this particular webinar, you probably saw that, and you may have been automatically registered. We have one, I think, about every 2 weeks for the rest of the summer that are all Azure-related topics where we'll get deeper into some specific issues or things. So take a look for those. Join us for those up and coming. And I think, let me check, but I think the thank you slide is next. It is. So I do appreciate everybody taking time out. I know it's difficult. We've all got busy schedules, but hopefully this was helpful to you. The most part is to get that, once again, think about things that you can do or might want to do, and then ask us those questions. Even if it's not right now and you think of something later on, we have all of our contact information. Okay? All right, well, I thank everybody for joining us and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.